computer or record it. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, cool.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. So just quick recap of where we are in the full stack development life cycle, or whatever you want to call it. We're still working on the Django framework. Yesterday, we continued to build out a CRUD app. Ankur introduced Django forms, and we're going to continue to build upon that. All right. So when we talk about nested CRUD or like RESTful APIs, if we kind of just go to, so we're thinking about getting another dog. We've got one dog already. He's already a big dog. He's a chocolate lab, but we might get another one, but our car isn't big enough. We have like a 2019 Honda Civic we bought last year for the city. So we were thinking about getting another dog, and depending on the size of the dog, we probably are going to need like a bigger car, unfortunately. So we were just messing around and looking at different places that have used cars. I know used cars have gone up and like prices like crazy. But here I went to CarMax, and you know, if we go to carmax.com/cars, so that's kind of very similar to what we've been doing, like /post/ whatever challenge we've been doing it, and that would list all the cars in here. But however, right here where it's not listing all the cars, but if we went like /all, this would literally just list all the cars in the entire database of CarMax. But let's just go back. So if you go to /cars and say /SUVs, so now it goes to cars /sports utilities. Normally we've been doing like a primary key to access all the sport utilities in a database, but here they just have a keyword, sport utilities, that have access to all the sport utilities. But where our case, we've just been using a primary key. You can do either or, but just for our purposes, we've just been using the primary key because it's very easy to query using a primary key. So we go to sport utilities and say we want to, we'll stick with a Honda just because, and now notice you see we have cars, sport utilities, /Honda. So nested routing, I'm sorry, not nested route. RESTful routing is essentially just a common URL pattern and how you name your URLs that are related to how you would query your database. So we have cars, sport utilities, Honda. If you go even further, like model, if you wanted like a CRV, now it goes cars. It's switched around a little bit, but it still goes like cars /Honda /sport utilities / the name of the actual the model. So again, RESTful routing, it's literally just a URL pattern and how it's a common URL pattern across the web on how you would create your routes to kind of emulate of how you would query your database. Kind of see here, this is another one, just kind of something we've been pretty familiar doing. You know, /dogs would just get a list of dogs. Dogs/new would present you a form to create a new dog. Dogs/dog ID or ID shows the individual detail of that dog. It shows like a detail page. Dog/ID. So you should be relatively familiar with this pattern so far. Dogs/ can create a new dog, but we can also just go with dog/new, which can create a new dog. But these are very familiar or common RESTful routing patterns. What questions do you have so far? And we've been doing this so far up until this point. But now we're going to be adding an additional layer similar to here. So we have, cars, and we're getting more granular. Honda is a brand that belongs to a car's model. Think of that. But so with that, we're going to go ahead and go through building out an application from scratch that uses nested CRUD, but essentially able to access, instead of just one model, it's going to have a one-to-many relationship. So we go to like posts and comments and able to access all the comments on a post, something similar to that. But with that, we're going to, instead of doing posts and comments, we're going to be doing, code platoon cohorts. So we're having a cohort and a student belongs to a cohort. So we're going to be able to see all the previous cohorts and all the students that belong to those cohorts. Questions? So with that, I'm going to go and I'm going to start completely from scratch. I'm going to be using, Django, and I'll use a Postgres database instead of the built-in SQLite database. So I'm going to CD into my desktop. CP is a challenges, Oscar Platoon, list everything out. And I'm just going to create a directory called make directory, nested CRUD example. And then I'm going to CD into that nested CRUD example directory. So I'm inside this nested CRUD example. Again, this is all also in today's pages, or in today's curriculum. So I'm literally just going through that. I'm going to maybe deviate from it a bit, but you can literally just go through this as well, and which you should do after we go through this lecture. Let me zoom in a little bit. All right, so I'm in the nested CRUD. So next, everyone should be pretty familiar. I need to create a virtual environment, python-make venv. And then I'm going to source into that virtual environment. So I'm in here, nested CRUD example. I'm currently in my virtual environment. So what are the two things we need to install once we're in a virtual environment?
Django and PsychoPG.
Yep, install Django and PsychopG2. Uh-oh, what happened? Pip install,
You spelled PsychoPG2 wrong. I think the S comes before the Y.
Thank you. Buckled under the pressure of live recording.
Can't be worse than Team USA losing
I'm sorry?
2 games. I say it can't be any worse than Team USA losing 2 games right now.
Oh, yeah. That's funny. To Australia, is that right?
Yep, last night.
Soon, man.
Yep. All right. So I installed PsychopG2. I installed Django. Now I'm going to create a Django project. That's just called old cohorts. So I'm going to do Django admin start project old _ cohorts. Does everyone do the period afterwards, or do people like the nested file structure? I'll use the period because I don't like the. All right. So I'm going to list everything out.
Is there like a best practice in terms of like, do you want to nest or do you want to have like outsiders as sort of like dealer's choice?
I think the reason why it naturally nests for you is because they assume you're going to be probably creating the project at like the root level. So it like makes the project folder first, and then it inside of that project folder, it has all like the manage.py file. But we already created a project folder here. So we don't need to like have it nested in this case. I noticed I didn't open this up into a new VS Code window. Let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to do code-r space period. There we go. But let's see what happens to my console. Notice how I'm no longer in my virtual environment. It's because I essentially reloaded the VS Code window. So I'm going to have to go back and source venv bin activate. There we go. So we have our old cohorts. Django project. Let's go ahead and mess with our settings. Let's just quickly create a database called CP Platoon cohorts, just CP underscore cohorts. So I'm going to create a DB CP cohorts. All right. Now, since this is a Postgres database and we're going to be using Postgres, I'm going to come down here into my settings.py file and PostgreSQL and the name of that file or the name of that database. All right. So I've got old cohorts. And next, I'm going to go ahead and start a new Django app, which I'm going to call Python manage.py start app, and just call it cohorts and students. Because literally it's just going to be an app that displays cohorts and the students associated with those cohorts. And there we go. We have cohorts and students Django app right there. What's the next step? Once we create an app, what should we do?
Add it to your set.
Yep. Don't forget to add it to your settings file. So I'm going to come back into my settings file, scroll all the way to the top. And inside of installed apps, Django already comes with these pre-installed apps like the admin panel, some authorization, content type sessions, messages, static files. And now we can add our cohorts and students app here. All right. There we go. All right. So shouldn't need to touch settings, anything right now. But let's go ahead and create our models for cohorts and students. So we have, probably a cohorts model and a students model. In cohorts, we'll have, just keep everything simple for right now. We'll have like a name for the cohort name. We can actually just call it cohort name. Let's make that what else should we have? A start date and end date. We can keep it simple for right now. We can do that. And now students might be a little bit different. A student belongs to a cohort. So what kind of a relationship is that?
It's a one-to-many.
All right. So I'm going to do new developer, how to make a one-to-many relationship in Django. All right. No, I don't want to be Stack Overflowed. I'm sorry if you hear that in the background. But yeah. So one-to-many relationships. Here's an example. So here's a reporter, and a reporter belongs to an article. So it looks like we can have a foreign key associated with the reporter, that model, and cascade. We can also have a related name in there as well. So we can have cohorts or cohort, and then we'll have first name, last name, and we'll keep that for right now. All right. So now we can go ahead and create our cohorts model. So models.model and cohort name equals models.char field, and we'll have max length. We'll just have it 200, and start date and end date. I'm going to keep these as char fields just for this purpose, just because I don't want to deal with the date formatting. I'll just have it as char field now, but these usually would be like a date field or date time field. But for just this purpose, I'm just going to keep it as char field just so it's easy to see data and we don't have to import the date time module or anything like that. So we have that. I'm going to also add something that under strings, just so things kind of display kind of nicely. But I'm going to actually comment that out initially. Let's do an F string. I'll just do cohort and then do self.cohort name. That works for right now. And then students, class student inherits from the models model class. And we can have cohort. And I don't remember what that syntax looks like, but it looks like something like so cohort. And then I guess we can do a related name equals students. What's the related name do again?
Basically creates the reciprocal of the key in cohort, so you can call cohort.students and be able to access those objects.
Exactly. Awesome. All right. First name, and we'll also just do char fields similar to that. First name and last name. And we'll also have a dunder string method for the students. Got to keep that. Whoop. And instead of, you can say first name, self.first name. I'll go ahead and format that a little bit nicer. Whoop. Down there, first name, last name. Whoop. And then I'll also just do the cohort. I'm going to do that and make it the ID, student ID, self.id. All right. So let's just quickly recap what we did. We created a Django app called old cohorts, which is going to display all the old Platoon cohorts. We created an app that is going to called cohorts and students, which is the app that's actually going to do the CRUDing of the cohorts and students. So I created a couple of models, cohort model, which is going to be like a cohort like Oscar platoon, India platoon, etc. And then I created a student class that's going to have all the students in the database, but a student belongs to a specific cohort. A student can't belong to multiple cohorts, and they can only belong to one cohort. Questions about what I just did? All right. So I created my models. Now what's the next step?
Make migrations.
Yep. Let me get them. I just want to be able to see everyone. All right. So Python manage.py make migrations. All right. Let's see what that does. All right. So cohorts and students migrations 001 Python created a model cohort and created a model student. And I can confirm that by coming over here into my migrations directory and seeing this 001 underscore initial.py script that was initially created. Next, I can actually migrate that script by doing Python manage.py migrate. And if I just want to migrate the cohorts and students app, I can actually name the app or list the app of what I actually want to migrate. So it literally just applied the migrations for the cohorts and students app. If I wanted to do all the internal migrations that Django comes with, I can run Python manage.py migrate, and it'll run all the scripts. So if I do that, it's going to run the remaining built-in migration scripts that Django comes with. All right. So now we can go ahead and let's add some dummy data. I'm going to go ahead and use Fixtures. I think it's kind of nice using Fixtures. But all right. So, and how do I load dummy data using Fixtures?
Don't you have to create a file?
Yep. Well, first I actually need to create a folder inside of our app
folder,
called
yeah.
Fixtures. And then in here, I'll create, I'm just going to create a C dot. There's a couple ways we can do it. We can use a YAML file or a JSON file. Well, so I'm going to use a JSON file because that's very common, and you're going to be working with JSON in the future. JSON. Like so. And I'm going to just copy some data around, or some dummy data that I already had off to the side that I can run, and hopefully it works. But you can also create data in the admin panel, or you can create it in the Python shell, or you can use Fixture or the Fixtures. All right. So if I run this, I'm going to pull up Postico just to look at all the different, where'd it go? CP. What am I looking at? Where's CP? CP cohorts. I notice here's my cohort table, and here is my students table. It doesn't have any data in it, but if I run, I think it's Python manage.py. Is it load data? Does anybody remember?
Sounds right.
It is low data.
Seed. Is it seed or seeds? Can't remember.
Whatever your file name is, you had it as seed.json.
Seed.json. All right, cool. So it installed 38 objects from one fixture, so you can also add additional files in here. And if I go back to my Postico and refresh, you can see all the students in there and all the cohorts in here. Cool. So I added some data. Now let's actually start building out our URLs and our views and our templates. So this part is all just going to be repetitive. This is like the part of the process that just keeps, it's like a circle, it's a loop. You just keep repeating over and over again. All right. So the first thing does anybody have any questions up until this point?
I have a question. I'm sorry. Where did you get the data from? I'm looking at the today's lecture.
So in our today's lecture, we add it manually using the Python shell.
Mm-hmm.
So if you wanted to add it manually, you can do Python manage.py shell. And in here, you can add it manually in here. But with this, you'd have to actually import the models and then, create Python objects from scratch and save it, which we've done in the past before.
Can you click on your seed.json file real quick?
Yep.
And
And I can add this as well. I'll add this to the a resource, so you can just click and get this data after the lecture. But yeah, you have your model, the app name followed by the model name. You manually add the primary key and whatever fields you have. And then for the related name, again, name of the app followed by the model, primary key, fields, and I'm just associated with which cohort. So cohort ID of 2. So I've come up here, cohort ID of 2. So that student down there should belong to Kilo Platoon. All right. All right. So now let's go ahead and start creating our actual routes or our URLs. So in our old cohorts Django project, inside of our URL patterns, we're gonna have to import include, and our path, we're gonna go to /cohorts or cohorts / and then this is going to look at the URLs file in our cohorts and students .urls file that's located in our cohorts and students app. So if you come up here, so the urls.py file, this is inside of our Django project directory. And now it's going to look into our apps URLs file, which we have yet to create. So we're going to have to go ahead and create that. So urls.py. And I'm going to split the screen there. And I'm just going to copy this over. We don't need admin. What else do we need? I think that's import path. And we don't need include. So we can delete that. But now when we just go to cohorts,
Did you just make that file, the urls.py in the old or cohorts and students?
yes. So in the cohorts and students app, I created a new file called urls.py file. And I'm going to add all the URLs that go to cohorts / something. And I'm going to make all the views and the templates from there. So here, the URL patterns, anything that goes to like localhost something / cohorts / is going to look inside of here. So this first one, cohorts / nothing, I want it to list all the cohorts. So I'm going to go into views.cohort_list. So it's going to look into my views file and look for a method called cohort list, which has yet to be created. And I'm going to use a named route or a name of the same name as the view method. And this is specifically for our named routes. So I still have to import my views. So I can say, hey, from the current directory, import everything or import the views file. Questions? So I want to display the cohort list, just a list of all the cohorts. So now I'm going to open up my views file. And in here, I need to create a def cohort list that takes in a request. So define a cohort list method that takes in a request. And in here, this should return or render an HTML template that just lists all the cohorts. So I need to query the database. So I'm going to list like cohorts equals cohort.objects.all. And up here, I'm going to have to import from the models directory. And I'm going to, from models, import the cohort model. And then, so I've got the cohorts. Now I need to return render. And I need to render the request. And I'm going to create a cohorts directory and render a cohorts list.html file, which I have yet to create, but I will shortly. And then I need to pass in a dictionary for Jinja, and it's going to list all the cohorts. So when I go to /cohorts, it's going to come into here, All right, there's nothing after the cohorts. It's going to look into my views and render a cohort list view method. Comes over here. It's going to query the database to grab all the cohort objects or all the cohorts from the database. And now it's going to try to pass that cohorts, a dictionary of cohorts, into a cohorts list HTML file, which has yet to be created. So inside of my cohorts and students app, I'm going to create another directory called templates. Then inside my templates directory, I'm going to create another directory called cohorts. And then inside of that directory, I'm going to create a cohorts underscore list.html file. And in here, I'm going to just copy some code and we'll walk through it. But I'm going to get rid of this for right now. So in this cohorts list, I'm going to display an H1 tag of all cohorts, and it's going to loop through for cohort in all the cohorts. So if I come over here. So I've got 4 individual cohorts in the cohorts, which is being passed in the view. It's going to list the cohort name as an ordered list or unordered list. So let's go ahead and see if we can get everything displayed. So if I run Python manage.py, run server. All right, nothing broke. That's usually good. Now, if I come over here and go to localhost 8000 and click enter, all right, there isn't a route that just goes to nothing. But if I go to /cohorts, there we go. I've got a list of cohorts. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So there we go. So let's just take a step back and kind of go through what I did. So in the projects, in the Django projects URLs file that already exists, I created a new URL to /cohorts, which once I go to that URL, it's going to look at the cohorts and students.urls file and to see match any other patterns in there. So it comes over here. So again, this is where it is at right now. It's coming into the URL patterns and it's going to test, hey, is there anything after this /? If there isn't, like this URL pattern, it's going to look into views, look for a cohort list method. So, all right, it's there. Now it's going to come over into the views file, looks for a cohort list method, runs this method. This method grabs all the cohort objects from the database, assigns it to a variable called cohorts, and then it renders the request, and it renders this cohorts list.html template and passed in a dictionary of cohort objects. Now, with Jinja 2, we've got access to all the cohorts. So we just do a simple for loop for cohort in cohorts, render the cohort name. And now you can see I'm rendering all the cohorts. What questions do you have about that?
For the for loop, can you explain that part one more time?
Yep. So in here, with regards to Jinja 2, there's a way we can embed Python code inside of an HTML template by using this was a curly brace followed by a %sign, and we can do for cohort in cohorts, and we can just render pretty much anything in here. So for cohort in cohorts, inside of a HTML tag, we can actually display what that is on the screen by doing a double curly brace followed by the cohort name. And this N4 is also needed in Jinja 2 just to know when that for loop should end, whatever that block of code is.
Okay, because for line 4, like the cohorts, is that referring to the line 8 in that views?
Yep,
Or
right here. It's this value.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yep.
Where are you importing Jinja?
Jinja is already comes built in with Django. Yep. So if we do, is it pip list? I believe it is pip list. Oh, it's not even in here, but yeah, it just comes with Django. It's just already how Django works. All right. So now we're displaying all the cohorts, but when I click on one of them, I want to see the cohort details. I want to see the start date, end date, etc. With that, I'm going to go ahead. So I created that one template. Now I'm going to come into here and create another view. I'm sorry, another URL called, I'm just going to bring that in here. Cohort details. So when I go to a specific cohort ID, so cohorts/cohort ID, I want it to look for a view called cohort detail. So now I come into here, I need to look for a cohort detail. So down here, I need to create a def cohort detail, which takes in the request, but it also takes in a cohort ID. So I'm going to copy that right there. And this is going to just do the same thing with regards to getting a single ID equals cohort ID, like so. So it's just querying to get that individual cohort. And instead of rendering cohort list, it's going to render a cohort detail.html file and just pass in a dictionary with a single cohort. So cohort detail passes in a cohort ID, which it gets it from the URL. I query the database for that specific cohort by passing in objects.get. That's going to throw an error. Grab that individual cohort, assign it to a variable called cohort. Now I'm rendering the request and a cohort. Let's do cohort detail page, HTML file, and I'm passing the individual cohort object into that cohort detail HTML, which I have yet to create. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create a cohort underscore detail page .html file. And now in here, I'm going to go ahead and, yep. Here I'm going to copy some code. I'm going to delete some of it. Just don't worry about that. Don't worry about.
So each new method is going to equate to like an HTML file, which is going to make a new web page.
Pretty much, yes. So in here, I've got, I guess we don't need that back button. So I just deleted a bunch of code, which will add to it. We'll add it back later. So in here, so I've got, let's go to my views. So where I'm passing in that individual cohort from the cohort detail, which is rendering the cohort detail HTML file, comes up here, cohort name, start date, cohort start date, end date, cohort end date. And these are just little attributes that are built into Django that allow like some, you'll see it just as like a line break. So if I come over here and refresh and literally just go to cohort/1, /1, not students. Uh-oh, what's going on?
Is it cohort instead of cohorts?
No, it should be. Let's look at this. What does it say? cohort ID, cohorts 1. Oh, let's just look at our URLs, just walk through the code base. So cohort ID. Oh, let's just do a / there. That's probably it. Cohorts. What? Cohort has no attribute object. Did I misspell something in my views?
Do you have to include it somewhere?
No.
I mean, import it?
Nope. Let's see what's going on. Cohort detail object. Is it objects? That looks like that's the error. Let's refresh that. There we go. So if I got Juliet Platoon, so I didn't have objects there. That was incorrect, as well as I didn't have a / there. But you can add that there. If I deleted that and go here now, it'll throw an error. But if I delete that, like so, it would still work. But I'm going to keep that there. All right. So I can go to /2, which is Kilo Platoon. 3. See how many we have. 5 November. Cool. So I'm going to cohorts, but I want to actually add a link here. So I'm going to have to add something back. So instead of having to manually go to it, I want to actually add a link to it. So in my cohorts list, I can add a link here. Let's just add this back. So what I did is just added this A tag here that references, that has an href that uses a named URL or a named route. So this is literally saying, hey, look for a URL that is named cohort detail. So look at, I'm coming over here, looking for a URL named cohort detail. Great, I found one. And now pass in this cohort ID into the path as the cohort ID. So once it does here, once I click it, it goes to this URL, and then it looks into the views, the cohort detail, cohort ID, and it just goes through that process. So if I refresh this, great. Now I've got these as links, and I can click there, and it works. Questions? All right.
So for the URL on the cohorts and students, so the first, I'm just kind of confused about the empty path.
What path? This
The
part?
URLs.
This part?
Yes.
Yep. So in the urls.py file inside of my Django project, I've got cohorts. So when you visit here, just anywhere, it first goes to your URLs file inside of your Django project. So inside of your URLs file, it looks for a URL pattern that matches whatever's inside of here. Once it does, I'm saying, hey, once you find a goes to /cohorts, then go look into the cohorts and students.urls file and look for an additional pattern. So when I go to /cohorts, then it goes, say, all right, I hit /cohorts. Now go look into the cohorts and students.urls file. All right, it's right here. Now it's at /cohorts. Now it's looking for a URL pattern that matches whatever comes after this. So it's empty, right? So it comes over here, and now it's an empty URL pattern. So it matches this one right here. And then it runs through the cohort list, view method. Does that help like kind of where the data is kind of looking into?
Yeah, I'm still pretty confused, but I'm just gonna have to rewatch this video like in class or something.
Okay. Yeah, and we can jump on a call afterwards just to walk through it. All right. So we're able to view a list of all the cohorts, view an individual cohort detail. Now let's go ahead and just create a new cohort. So when I go to cohorts/new, so if I go to path/new, I want to go to views/new cohort method, name, new cohort. And now inside of my views, delete that. Which one is this? All right. So now inside of my views, let's go ahead and create a new cohort. Def new cohort. And this takes in a request. It doesn't need to take in an ID or anything. And this new cohort method will be responsible for two things. One is to get a form to create a new cohort. And then the other one is to actually save that new cohort once you submit it. So it needs a post request to save the request or save it to the database, and a get to display a form. And this saves a new cohort. So let's just first, when we visit /new, which nothing's going to show up now, it's going to throw me an error or display form. Yep. It's going to throw an error because they're right here, because new cohort didn't return HTTP response object, which it hasn't right here. But first, let's go ahead and get a form to display it. So from yesterday's lecture, we can use Django's built-in model forms, which makes our life a lot easier instead of creating a form from scratch. So inside of our cohorts, let's just create a new file called forms, or forms.py. And in here, I'm going to just copy some code and we'll walk through it. Just delete that. So we're importing forms from Django, and we're importing our model or cohort model, cohort model from the models file. And we're creating a class just called CohortForm, and that's just the standard way of calling that class because it's a form for the cohort model, and it's inheriting from the model form class in Django. And it has this meta class in here. That's just the syntax of how Django uses model forms. And this meta class only requires two attributes, or essentially two things, which is what model are we getting this, or what model do we want to create a form of? So we want to use the cohort model, and then what fields do we want to include? So we want to have the cohort name, the start date, and end date. That's just what we want. We can add, we don't have to include these, but we want to include them all. So I'm going to go over here in my views. So we want to do this get request first to just display a form. So we can say, hey, I want to use the cohort form, which I'm creating a new instance of that, and just return render the request. I'm going to do cohorts. I'm going to create a cohort underscore form.html file, and I'm going to pass in that form as a dictionary. I'm going to also type in type of request, I'm gonna add in some other data in here. And this is specifically for a new cohort. So what I'm gonna have to do also is from forms, import the cohort form. Get rid of that pass. All right, so I created a form, a model form specifically. Literally, it's just going to help us fill out. It's going to render the fields for us to create a new cohort. And it does a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So I created a new model for CohortForm instance, and I'm passing that form as an object into this CohortForm HTML file, which I have yet to create. So I'm going to, again, create a URL, create the view, and then create the template. So I'm going to do a cohort_form.html file. And in here, I'm just going to copy some code and kind of walk you through it. Go over this way. So this cohort form, I'm just typing the type of request. This type of request, it says new. So it's going to say new cohort. And then the form, it's going to be a post request, the method. I'm going to need the CSRF token, which is for security. And all I have to do is form.asp, and it's going to render out the fields, like the input fields for this specific form. So if everything works correctly, go like that, and there we go. And there's like as P, there's I think as table. I think Ankur showed you that yesterday, and there's like as a couple other ones. But this little code right here literally renders these 3 input boxes for us. What questions do you have?
Is the save button already tied to those in that, or no?
It is not. So I had to create that myself. And this ASP, it literally looks at the model and sees what type of character or what field type it is, and it'll render it based off of what type of field. So if it's a date and time, it'll render a date time thing. If it's a text area, the box will be a lot bigger. If it's like, I think it can also render drop downs based off of Boolean values, or if it's like a Boolean field, it'll be like a checkbox. So depending on the type of field you have in your model will determine what is actually rendered here. It does a lot of heavy lifting for us, so we don't have to create these from scratch using HTML.
Hey, Tom, where does the method equals post come from?
Right here?
Yeah, right there.
What do you mean? Where does it come from?
Or like, what is the method doing right there?
So this determines what type of method, when I click save, what type of method this form is going to be. I can make it a get request, or a put request, or a delete request. It's just attaching what type of what type of HTTP request is going to trigger when I click this save button. And we want it to be a post request because we want to save data to the database. Pretty much all the time, it's going to be a post request.
Okay.
Even if you're deleting stuff.
So what's the purpose of having the double curly brackets and then type of request, and having that tied to the second, or I guess the first index of the object you're passing in?
So like right here, wait, so why
Yeah, I mean, it's already hard coded as new for like the value of that particular object. I mean, like, why not just hard code it in the H2 tag?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and we'll get to that. But I want to use this form to also edit. So I'm going to use the same CohortForm HTML file, this same code, when I want to edit a cohort. So that's because so this form isn't just specifically to post new cohorts. It's also going to be able to edit existing cohorts as well. So that's why. And we'll show you when I get to edit. All right. So once I click this and click save, so it went to new cohort and now I click save, it's going to run this new cohort function again. But now it's no longer a get request to display a form. I want to actually save it. So in here, I can say, hey, if the request dot method equals a post request, I can do some stuff to it. So I can say form equals cohort form request dot post. So it's literally creating a new cohort form object. Where'd it go? Where's the form? Did I delete it? And it's going to look through, it's going to automatically bind the cohort name, start date, end date to this cohort form. And then I'm going to say, hey, if the form dot is valid, so it does some validations for us just to make sure everything that I typed in there is valid. So I'm not typing in like a date, time, or doing other stuff, attaching other data to the form. Then I'm going to say, hey, cohort equals form dot save, commit to false. So it's not officially saving it. And then I'm going to cohort actually save it to the database. And then after I save it to the database, I want it to automatically redirect me to that cohort detail page. So I'm going to have to import, oh, what the hell is this? Import redirect, which is I'm able to redirect it. So redirect, and it's going to look for a cohort detail route name. I'm going to pass in the cohort ID equals cohort.id. Oh, wait. Yep.
What's the purpose of that commit equals false?
Oh no. What the hell? Can everyone still hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
I got
we're still here.
Okay. All right. Commit equals false means it's I actually don't remember off the top of my head. I'll have to research that. Yeah, that's a good question, but I'll get back to you on that. I think it saves the form as is, and it just doesn't save it to the database. If I recall, it doesn't automatically save it to the database.
So you do need it instead of just doing form.save?
Yes. There's something, it like saves it to the form, but it doesn't actually commit it to the database yet. And there is a reason for that. I quite don't remember off the top of my head as to why we needed it like that. All right. So this here, let's actually just go ahead and walk through this, see if it works. So if I wanted to create a new cohort, I could say Oscar Platoon. Start date, I don't remember. Does anybody remember 05 dash, was it 24? And
Something like that.
09 dash
03.
03 dash 2021. Well, you know the dates. Can't wait.
All dates.
All right. All right. And if I click save.
That's when my terminal leaf starts. That's the reason I remember.
Nice. Yeah. So notice how I click save and it came into here. It tested whether or not the method was a post request, which it was. And it put that post request inside the cohort form, created a cohort form object, tested whether or not all that stuff I typed in there was valid to that form. Form save commit false, saved it to the database, and then redirected me to the cohort detail page. So it looks over here for a URL, cohort detail, and it passed in the new cohort ID of which it's saved. So yeah. And then it redirected me to that. All right. Questions up until this point? All right. All right. So far, we've been able to list all the cohorts, view individual cohort detail, and also going to create a new cohort. Let's add some back buttons on here real quick, just so you don't have to manually keep typing in the URL where we're going. So in the cohort detail, we can add a back button by doing a named URL or named route by doing href looks for a URL that is called, where'd it go? That is called cohort list. And it's just pushing back or pressing back. So it comes under here, looks for a cohort list. All right, runs that cohort list view method, comes in here and then lists all the cohorts. So if I come over here where are we going? Here, there, I get a back button. It just takes me back to the cohort list. Let's do the same thing for that new cohort. So we'll pretty much add that to CohortForm as well. Just down here, just add a back button. So if I go to /new, I also get a back button as well. That takes me to the cohort list. But I also want to have a link that takes me to create a new cohort as well. So I can go ahead and do the same thing back here, but add a new button. So I'm coming over here into the cohort list, and down here, I'm just adding another href, looks for a URL called new cohort, and it just displays create a new cohort. So it comes over here, looks into I don't know where the URLs went. URLs, looks for a new cohort named route, and just goes to the new cohort view method, which will display a form initially. So if I come over here and do a quick refresh, I got create a new cohort, which will take me to a new cohort. Questions about that? All right. So let's go ahead and keep building on the routes. So I'm able to create view or list of all cohorts, create a new cohort, view a cohort by its ID. Now I can let's edit a cohort. So same thing, cohort ID, but we want to edit that cohort ID. And we can edit cohort, actually edit cohort. So it's going to need to look for a view method called edit cohort. And it's going to look very similar to this new cohort method. But I'm just going to copy some code and come down here and paste that, and we'll walk through. Cohort.objects.get. All right. So same thing here. So when it comes to edit cohort, it needs to display a form where I'm able to edit that cohort. So in the URLs, it's passing in the cohort ID, and inside the edit cohort view method takes in that cohort ID, finds that cohort in the database. It's saying, hey, if the method is a post request, which initially it's not going to be, it's just going to be a normal form. It's going to say, hey, in the cohort form, pass in the instance of this cohort inside of that form. So it's already filled out with like what's already in the database. And yeah. And then also render, what's going on? Yeah, and then return this form. I think that should be indented a little bit. So here with a type of request, it's an edit request. but we're passing that form in, and we're also displaying that cohort form HTML file. So let's just look here. Let's go ahead and edit Oscar Platoon. So if I go to /edit, cohort 6 cannot unpack non-iterable int object. What does that mean? What's going on? Oh, I think that is what it's doing. Nope. Edit cohort ID /edit, edit cohort ID equals cohort ID. That's what I think I needed. There we go. So it came over here, grabbed the object from the database, came over here, passed that instance of the cohort into the form. So it's already kind of it's already created for us. Like it's already filled out for us. So if I didn't want it to say Oscar Platoon, if I wanted to just say Oscars or Oscar, something like that, when I click save, it's going to come up here, run this edit cohort again, grab that cohort from the database. Now it's a post request because the cohort is a post request. Passing in the request in the cohort form, just like it was in the new cohort, but it's also passing in the instance of the cohort because some things may not have been updated, runs through the same, validates the form.save commit equals false. I looked it up. It's if you want to add additional data to the cohort object. For example, if we didn't include all the data that's required for that model, we can add it here. So it doesn't save it to the database. We can add it here, but in this case, we really don't need to add anything. Then it just redirects us back to the cohort detail page. So if I just said Oscars or Oscar Platoon edit and click save, now it's Oscar Platoon edit. Again, the only difference is we're grabbing the current cohort for the edit and we're passing that instance into the cohort form, which pretty much makes it already pre-filled out for us. That's really all it's really doing. Questions?
There'd be some way that we could have a form where they could not change the name, but they could change the dates.
I'm pretty sure there is a way to limit, like prevent them from touching the fields. I'm sure there is a way. We'd have to look into the documentation for that. Yeah. All right. So in here, we should probably add an edit button. So it takes us to the actual edit portion of like to be able to edit instead of having to manually go in there. So I can go into edit or cohort detail, just like we did with the back button. We can go to, instead of cohort list, we can go to, what is it? Edit cohort. Edit cohort, and then in here we'll have to pass in a cohort ID. ID equals cohort.id. So if I do that, it's going to go into here, look for a URL called edit cohort. Oh, where's the URLs? Looks for a thing called edit cohort, and then passes that cohort ID in the URL right here and takes me to this route. So if I refresh that, edit cohort, it takes me right to edit the cohort. Questions? All right, so I can go back, edit cohort, I should say back to list of, so yeah, anyway. So Oscar Platoon, I can edit a cohort. Now let's go ahead and try to delete a cohort. All right. So delete in the cohort detail. Well, actually, let's create a URL pattern. Instead of cohort ID edit, we want to go to cohort ID delete and go to delete cohort. And then in here, we need to go into our views. And here, def delete cohort takes in the request, cohort ID coming from that URL. And we can say, hey, if the request dot method equals a post request. Again, pretty much everything is a post request. We're not going to do a delete request. I'm going to go cohort equals cohort.objects.get ID equals cohort ID. So it looks for that in the database. And then I can run that cohort delete. And so it just deletes it directly from the database. And I can return, I'm going to redirect to, once I delete the cohort, I just want to redirect me to the cohort list named route. All right. So if I come over here and if I want to delete Oscar Platoon, because these are old cohorts, I can go to delete and click enter and no, whoop, it didn't do that. Why didn't it do it? Oh, does anybody know why?
Because you didn't post, you get id from
Yep.
slash.
So if I do the print request method, I can kind of see if I go to Oscar Platoon, delete, like so, I can see the type of request down here is a get request, which I don't want. So I want a way to actually just press a button that actually does a post request. So in my cohort detail page, I can create a form that is literally just a simple form that, let's do HR and just create a form. The name of the form is, delete cohort, method equals post, action. I'm just going to copy this over, it's easier. So the name, delete cohort, it's a post request, and it's got the CSRF token. And the only thing it has in here is an input that's a type submit. So it submits this form, and it just with a value of delete cohort. So it shows up like a button. When I click delete, it looks for a delete cohort. Delete cohort route. So it looks at delete cohort and it passes that cohort ID into the delete cohort. So it goes to that URL, delete cohort, passes that cohort ID, goes to /delete, comes over here, delete cohort, passes that cohort ID. It is a post request, goes in the database, looks for that cohort, deletes it, and then just redirects me to the cohort list with that, the new updated cohort list. So if I refresh this, Oscar Platoon edit, I've got delete cohort right here. Now it's gone. Cool, I can Oscar Platoon 04-24-2021. So I can create new cohorts. I can edit a cohort. So it's like 26 or something. I can delete a cohort. Great. But now let's go into students. So this is where the nested CRUD, I can add additional routes onto here, like students, and view all the students associated with cohort 4. So with that, I'm going to just do some copying right now. So these URL patterns are for all the cohort views. And the next ones are going to be for the student views or student URLs. So we're just essentially going to be continuing on adding on to that. So we have a cohort ID / students, which is going to display a student list. So let's go ahead and do that. So if I go to cohort ID / students, it's going to look for a students list that's going to be all the students associated with this cohort. So if I come over here, so these are all associated with cohorts. Now let's go ahead and actually start creating the student views. Student views. So this URL looks for a student list. So I can say def student list, which takes in the request, not question, request. But up here where the cohort list just takes in the request, we want to also take in a cohort ID because we want to just extract all the students associated with that cohort. So student list, we have got the cohort ID. And now we can cohort dot objects dot get ID equals cohort ID. And does anybody remember the query from starting with a cohort to extract all the students associated with that cohort? Does anyone remember?
Reduce.
So I've got the cohort object right here. So I'm starting from here.
Just be cohort.students.all because we named it students when we created the foreign key.
Yep, exactly. Cohort.students.all. Like so. So that's because we named this related name students, which is the reverse query that we're able to grab all the students associated with the cohort. So cool. We have all the students associated with this cohort, whatever it may be. And now we can return, render the request. I'm going to create a new directory called students and create a student list.html file. And I'm going to render a cohort as well as students like so. So I'm not only passing in the students, I'm also passing in the cohort to the student list HTML file, which I've yet to create. So inside of my templates, I'm going to create a students.
Is there a reason why you on line 50 you deleted the second part of the students?
On line 50. Nope. There we go. So I'm going to create a directory under my templates called students. That is pretty much just going to mirror the same thing as the cohorts, but it's just going to be a little bit different. So students list, is that what I called it? Students list.html. And in here, it's just going to loop through all the students. So I'm just going to add, it's very similar to the URLs or the cohorts list, but in addition to passing in all the students, I also can pass in the cohort. So I can actually list out, instead of saying all cohorts, I can say the cohort name followed by all the students. So in here, I'm just going to do that. let's get rid of this for right now. So I've got the cohort name, all students for whatever cohort, and then for student in students, just list the student name, first name. Or I can actually, yeah, that's good. So let's go ahead and see if this works. So if I go to cohort Mike Platoon, I don't think there's any students in there, but if I go to Juliet Platoon and go to /students, there we go. I've got all the students listed out right there. Now we can keep going. Got a list of all the students. Now what do we want to go into? So we got cohort list. Now cohort detail. So now we have the student list. Maybe we should grab the student detail. Oh, that's new student. Let's go to the new student or the student detail. So cohort ID followed by students, followed by the student ID. So this is where it becomes nested. So cohort ID /students/student ID. So here, maybe you want to go to /student 5 and have it display student 5 right there. So we've got views student detail page. So let's go to views, def student detail. Now here, we're going to have to pass in the request, the cohort ID, as well as the student ID, because we're grabbing the cohort ID as well as the student ID. And again, we can do cohort, grab that cohort, grab that student, student.objects.get ID equals student ID. Looks like I have to import student up here. All right. And then return render request, and then the students dot student detail .html file followed by, again, pretty much the same thing here, cohort and student. But instead of students, we'll do individual student. And we have a student detail HTML. We're gonna have to create a student detail HTML, detail.html. All right. So we've got a student detail HTML. It's going to look very similar to the cohort detail with like student name, like so. So we're listing the student first name, last name, and what cohort they belong to. So if we come over here, let's see what student 5 looks like. Jesse Rodriguez, member of Juliet Platoon. If we go to students /4 or 3, there we go. Questions so far? All right. So let's go ahead and make these links so I can actually visit each individual student. So in order to do that, I can go to student list, where my student list go, and add that named route back. So here it's looking for a URL named student detail. So student detail, there we go. And now it's looking for the cohort ID, which I'm passing in the cohort in here. So it accesses the cohort ID. And right here it's going to pass that as the number for that URL for this cohort ID, and as well as the student ID. So anyway, yeah. So cohort ID equals cohort.id and the student ID equals student.id. And it's passing those values into the URL right here. And then it's going into student detail, comes over here, student detail, passes in the cohort ID, student ID, extracts the cohort and student from the database and renders the student detail page right here. So if I refresh this, if I hover over there in the lower left-hand corner of the web page, you can see localhost 8000/cohorts/1 students 12 for Robert. Students 12. Merlin, students 4, etc. So we can continue going on, creating a new student. So cohort ID followed by students/new. So we can create a new student. So we can go to views, and very similar to that of creating a new cohort, we just need to add a little more code to it. Let's go ahead and create it. Def, is it new student? We can take in the request, the cohort ID, because we need to know what cohort that student belongs to. Cohort equals objects. Probably should create a method for that because I keep repeating it. Again, if it's a post request, do something up. If it's a get request, display a form, just like we were doing up here in new cohort. So we have a cohort form. Probably going to need a student form. So I'm going to import student model. And same thing down here. Instead of a cohort form, we're going to create a student form. That corresponds to the student model. And for here, we're going to have the first name. And I can't remember what the other first name, last name, and maybe the cohort. Yeah, and the cohort associated with that student. So if I come up here, I need to import the student form. Like so. And for the get request, let's create let's just say like, hey, if request dot method equals post, do something. I'm just going to pass right now. Else, do something very similar to here. Just like very similar or not, that's edit. So we want to do something like so. So form, instead of cohort form, we want it to have a new student form. Instead of cohorts, we want the student form. And form is the same. Type of request is also a new student form. So now we just have to create, like we did a cohort form, we need to create a student form. .html. And just like we did with a cohort, where'd the cohort form go? Cohort form. Just copy that over. Form as P. Let's do, I don't even know if we need this in there. So instead of type of request new cohort, we want it to be a new student. All right. So if everything works correctly, whoop, what happened? Start date, end date. Where is that being populated at? Oop. Student form. specified student. Where miles. Uh-oh. Where's that? First name, last name, cohort. Form. That's good. I think everything should work. Start date, end date specified for student. All right, let's students. Okay. All right, everything's working. Student / new. Okay. I just had to restart the server. So now I notice I go to first name, last name, and cohort, and I can see the different cohorts applied here. But maybe I want it to be already filled out as to like what cohort this is associated with. I can actually do that because this should be associated with like Juliet Platoon. I can actually do that by in the student form. This isn't required. Like you can have this, have the person select it manually, or you can have it like already filled out for you. I can say in the student form, in the cohort field, pass in the cohort object. So now if I refresh this, it gives these specific things, but it's okay. But notice how the cohort is already automatically filled out for you. And I can always change this as well. So when I create a new student, let's actually go back to the cohorts. Let's create a new Oscar Platoon / students. So all students for Oscar Platoon, there aren't any. If I go to new, let's say done Kelly, and click save. I want it to do something. So what I can do, and once it comes into the request method for post, I can, very similar to the cohort form, pass in the request.post. If the form.is valid, I can say the student equals form.save commit equals false. And now I can actually, this is where that I can apply that specific cohort to that. Yeah, that's a good. So there's a couple ways I can do it. With the way I currently have it, I can just do students.save. I believe I can just do students.save and then have it redirect me just like it does up here into the new cohort. I can do the very same thing, but redirect me to the student detail. So I'm just going to come over here, redirect me to the student detail where student cohort ID, student ID. I just want to see if this works. All right, Don Kelly, and if I save it right there, or if you don't want to be able to customize it when I create a new student. So right here, whatever this is Oscar Platoon. If I don't want to change that, I can remove that from the form. I can remove that part from the form if I wanted to. And if I refresh it, whoop, what just happened? Restart the server. Like so. So I just fill out the name of the student and the first and last name of the student and just have it automatically apply it to Oscar Platoon. I can do that by doing this part right here. So before I actually commit this or save the student, I can apply student.cohort. So this is a student object that only has a first and last name applied to it in this scenario. And I can say, hey, the cohort object I want to apply to it is this cohort object. And then I can actually save it to save that student. So if I refresh this like so, and I can do James White and save it. So James White is a member of Oscar Platoon. So yeah, and now I can come over here. Uh-oh, students, what happened? There we go. So there's James and Don. And I can change that URL pattern just to make sure it works when I redirect it. Students right here. I'm just gonna add that URL, that / there. So, all right. So I created a new student. Let's add a couple more. Save it. There we go. And now if I go back to students, now just like we did with creating a new student, we can edit that student. So it's looking for a edit student method.
Just so you don't delete students.
I'm sorry?
Just so you don't delete students.
Just so I don't delete students?
Wouldn't be nice to delete students from Oscar Platoon.
Oh, no, not at all. So just like I did for edit cohort, I'm going to do the same thing for edit student, but I'm going to add a little bit more code in there. So for edit student, I need the cohort ID and the student ID. So I'm just doing that. Cohort.objects.get ID equals cohort ID. Then student.objects.get ID equals student ID. So I grab each cohort from the database and the student. And just like when I edited, I'm passing in the student instance into the student form and returning the student form the same student form as before, but instead of having it be a new student, I want to be able to edit the student. And same thing, once I edit the student and post it, inside the student form, I pass in the post request and the instance of the student, and it just runs through the same code, redirects me to the student detail. So if I want to edit James, and I do edit, I can edit James. So yeah, James edit and save it. James edit, wait, and now I can go back to students there. I can edit it back. So almost there. Now let's just add some back buttons and buttons to actually add a student. Let's actually go back to here. So I can delete a cohort, but I just want to see a list of students as well, like a button where I can actually get to the list of students. So this is in the cohort detail, I believe. So in the cohort detail page, where does my code go? Cohort detail page. There's the div that deletes. I'm going to do HR. I got a named route going to the student list, which goes to looks for a student list name method, passes in that cohort ID right here, cohort ID down there, looks for that cohort ID, runs that student list view method, student list, and then just runs through this portion of the code. So if I refresh that, students in this cohort, I get these 3 students. Can also add a back button to the students list. Where is it? So cohort list, let's add students in this cohort. Edit cohort. And say back to cohort, which would look for a, what is it, cohort detail. There we go. Students in this cohort, back to cohort. Now in here, I can probably want to add a student link to actually go to new/new. So back to cohort. Let's add another one. New student. I think that's pretty much it. Add new student to cohort name. Oh, where did I add that? Oh, I added to the cohort detail. That's not what I wanted. So student list. Refresh. There we go. Last but not least, let's go ahead and delete a student. Cool. So in our URLs, I'm going to delete. Last one, cohort ID / student ID delete goes to delete student method. So it comes over here. We have edit student. Last but not least, let's go ahead and def delete student. Takes in the request, takes in the cohort ID, takes in the student ID. Say if the request, just like we did with method, just the delete cohort. Let's say student equals student dot objects dot get ID equals student ID student dot delete, and just return redirect to the student underscore list, and we're gonna have to pass in the cohort ID to get to the student list associated with that cohort. Oh, I think we just pass in cohort ID equals cohort ID. Now in the student detail page, we can again just create a quick form. Like so. Delete, not delete cohort, delete student, delete student. So looks for a name, delete student, looks for a URL, delete student, passes in the cohort ID and the student ID as well. And allows us to delete a student. And delete that student. Let's actually create a link to the edit. So do we have an edit cohort? So here's an example edit cohort. We pretty much emulate that link to edit student. But in addition to a cohort ID, we also need to add student underscore ID to the student ID. Edit student. So if I refresh that, I can edit the student, change edit, save. And now I also can delete it. It took me back to Oscar Platoon students. What questions do you have about nested CRUD?
No questions, but I think I'll understand a lot more as soon as I get some hands-on experience with it.
Yep. Yeah, it's just repeat. Just think of it, URLs, views, templates, URLs, views, templates. Just repeating that entire thing. And students in this cohort, you can see all the different students. You can edit this student. Alex. Save, takes me back to Alex. I can edit that student. I can delete them. There we go. All right. With that, I am going to stop the recording.